The Great Katanas are one of the better weapon categories to come out of the DLC, and this weapon type is actually very comparable to things like curved greatswords, in that their larger types are slashing based options that basically gets very similar weight, damage, stamina cost, and even stance damage. Now there are going to be some slight differences between the two, and just for another comparison, these are all very similar to like greatsword types of damage numbers as well. Now there are going to be some differences between the two, and for the most part I might lean more towards the Great Katanas due to them having more variety with their moveset, and also having passive bleed. Their movesets always get mixed up of vertical attacks, horizontal swipes, and even poking attacks, which is definitely lacking on things like the curved greatswords, and them just coming with passive bleed, which is like the best status effect in the entire game, only just makes them a lot better. So when paired alongside different types of weapon skill options, specifically like repeating thrust or blood tax, it can make for very broken builds, because for some reason a weapon type that hits as hard as this one can be infused with these skills, and they hit multiple times in quick succession, do amazing damage, proc bleed really quickly, and in blood tax's case it actually gives you health regen too. So I think these are the best options for the Great Katanas. They do also have their own unique skill in overhead stance, which actually has recently gotten indirectly buffed due to the Rellana's cameo change. And with the Rellana's cameo, it actually can outdamage things like blood tax and repeating thrust, but you do have to charge it up first for you to get to that point, and it's not going to be doing as much bleed build-up, and also not doing piercing damage, which is the best damage type in the game. Now, as for the things that curved greatswords actually do better, one is going to be their heavy attacks, which the Great Katana heavy attack is not that bad, which does serve as this nice horizontal swipe, and does complement the moveset pretty well. But it actually is incredibly slow. Even the uncharged version is really slow, where compared to the curved greatswords, the uncharged version is actually faster than the light attack, and these charged heavy attacks can be doing just as much stance damage as the Great Katanas too. And also, for some reason, the Great Katanas just get no hyper armor. Obviously outside of the RAKSHASA'S katana, but for some reason they just don't get any at all. Whereas things like curved greatswords and regular greatswords actually do, with every single part of the moveset, which for PvE is probably not going to be the biggest deal in the world. But there might be some instances where you are fighting like smaller types of enemies, and you will notice it being very frustrating. But overall, I do consider them to be a very good weapon type, and all three options are just amazing as well. Starting off at the bottom, we have the Dragon Hunter's Great Katana, which is the lowest damaging Great Katana in the game, as it does have a really poor quality-based scaling. It also is the heaviest Great Katana in the game with the worst range, and actually does get the exact same moveset as the regular Great Katana. Now thankfully it actually still retains some bleed buildup, and actually does get a pretty decent skill in Dragon Wound Slash, which for 18 FP does this like little downward swipe, which uncharged is like practically useless. It does like basically the exact same damage as a charged heavy attack, and basically the exact same range but for less stance damage and like very similar speeds, but it's just going to consume 18 FP. You actually do get a little bit of hype armor, unlike the heavy attack that gets none, so it might be decent to use in that instance, but just having it fully charged is where it's going to be at, because it does turn it into a projectile, and obviously when fully charged, pairing it alongside the Godfrey's icon can just make it do amazing damage, especially at these closer ranges, to where it actually can do a total of 33 stance damage as well. And as I always mention, projectile attacks are very easy to use, and they can just cheese a whole bunch of enemies. This one in particular is going to cheese a whole bunch of dragons, because the weapon itself does actually do bonus damage to them, and if you just lock onto their head and spam the skill, every single one of these guys are just going to be destroyed. Now, it's probably not going to do it as fast as things like Pest Thread Spears or Shard Spiral, but it still is going to do it pretty well. But the main reasons why I'm going to put it lower is because it does get a poor quality scaling, so therefore it's going to get not as much damage, and it's not going to have any synergy with spell types of builds either. And if you actually did want to projectile attack with a Great Katana, I just think the regular Great Katana infused with something like Stormblade is probably just going to do it better. Number 2, the RAKSHASA'S Great Katana, which this weapon has one of the best movesets in the entire game. I see this very similar to how I see the Serpent Hunter, in that it's like a flawless moveset, but it doesn't really have anything to make it really broken or cheese a whole bunch of bosses in PvE. But to start off with, it actually does just get a very good dexterity scaling, and at basically any level, it can get very respectable damage and outdamage all the other Great Katanas, unless you're including other types of weapon buffs. It still gets passive bleed, and it also does get the best Great Katana moveset in my opinion, as the heavy attack is going to be a nice poke, which is obviously good because it's doing piercing damage, but it also is a faster animation, which is one of my major problems with the Great Katana heavy attack in general, is how slow that it actually is, and the fact that it gets no hyper armor. But with the RAKSHASA'S katana, it's going to be relatively quick, and it actually does get hyper armor. And it gets hyper armor with every single attack, which I don't know why the other Great Katanas didn't get any hyper armor with their movesets, but thankfully this one does, and actually it gets roughly Great Hammer types of hyper armor as well, so you can tank a whole bunch of attacks in the middle of your attack combos. Now this actually does sound very nice, but unfortunately there is a trade-off to where you actually take 10% more damage in the middle of these attack combos, which in PvE is definitely a big downside, because there's not many circumstances to where you're going to benefit more of the hyper armor, but there's going to be plenty of situations where you're going to take a whole bunch of damage in the middle of your attack combos, and you're going to be dying a lot faster than you normally would. but when you are fighting these smaller types of enemies, I definitely think it is a net positive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the horizontal swiping heavy attack actually is a very good complement to the Great Katanas, because typically you just get a bunch of poking attacks or vertical swipes. But the skill in the RAKSHASA'S Great Katana is just a bunch of horizontal swipes, so it just is like the flawless moveset. You get access to basically every single type of swing, different types of damages, get a whole bunch of hyper armor, relatively faster movesets, good stance damage, passive bleed. But yeah, the only thing stopping me from putting it into the S tier is the fact that you do just take bonus damage in the middle of your attack combos. And it also just doesn't really have that high damaging skill or like really broken projectile to make it cheese the entire game like other different types of S tier weapons would. And that's number one, the Great Katana, which is the only infusible Great Katana in this game, and it is going to be the major reason why it does get into the S tier, and that's because that passive bleed weapons that can be infused is always going to be a major benefit, because you can pair it alongside Blood Flame Blade to make it do like roughly twice as much bleed buildup, or you can go into an Occult infusion and pair it alongside an Arcane build, which is also going to make you do a lot of bleed and have good synergy with spells. But even then, I think the best thing about it is going to be the fact that it can be infused with a bunch of really good skills like Repeating Thrust, Blood Tax, and Overhead Stance. Now, I do think that Blood Tax is like the best amongst them, as it does hit so many times in quick succession to help proc the multi-hit talismans. It's going to proc bleed really quickly, and it's give you a whole bunch of health regen. Like, if you actually wanted to build around one of these different types of skills, the Great Katana is like the best option for it. You're going to get amazing damage, gets good bleed build up, get decent stance damage, and you're going to have your weapon movesets complement this perfectly. You're going to have access to poking attacks, horizontal swipes, and vertical swipes. Like, the only downside that I can say about the Great Katana is that it just doesn't get any hyper armor. I kind of wish that it did. It would have made it a lot more versatile, but it still is deserving of an S tier weapon, as it does get some of the most damage in class, and it is the lightest with the lowest requirements, and you get it right at the beginning of the DLC. Okay, that's now completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is going to be the Beast Claws, which is actually the last of the weapon categories that we are going to cover until we move on to the seals and the staves. So yeah, it's been a pretty funny 2-month journey in ranking all these weapons, but yeah, it's finally coming to an end. So catch you guys in that video.